Hello, and welcome again to another talk on Christian evidences or Christian apologetics. Today's talk is entitled, Is the Story of Jesus Based on Pagan Mystery Religions? Let me review something we said in an earlier talk. I said at that time that there were generally three views of how the gospel should be viewed or how it's looked at as far as being history. There's the traditional Orthodox view that basically says that the gospels are substantially historical and we can depend upon them for our historical information about Jesus. There was a middle view that I talked about that's very much adopted by many scholars today that says that the Gospels are a mixture of history and fabrication, that some of the stuff is really true about Jesus, much of the historical stuff we have, but there's a lot that developed and was fabricated as the church grew in its early years. We talked about that quite a bit already. Then there's an extreme view that wants to say that the Gospels are almost all entirely fictional. That's the view that I want to talk about today. Now, there's not many people who hold this view, but those few people who hold it often hold it with very loud voices. So we need to address it because it's very common out there today. This view, I'm going to call this view the Pagan copycat theory. The basic idea behind the view is that the story of Jesus as presented in the Gospels is a myth, and it incorporates various aspects of other ancient pagan religions, what we call the mystery religions. Now, what are the mystery religions? Well, in the Mediterranean world of the time of Jesus and afterwards, there were a number of small little religious groups that held to different religious views and held to different gods and worshiped them different ways, and we called them mystery religions, mostly because they had some mysterious aspect to them, a secret that you had to know in order to become a member of that particular group. They were very secretive in that way. They were called the mystery religions. There are those who believe that Jesus, the story of Jesus, is simply a fabrication, a fictional account that was made up by combining different aspects of these mystery religions. Let me give you a recent example of this. Perhaps you've seen online a movie known as the Zeitgeist movie. This is a movie that was produced by Peter Joseph, was released online about 2007, June of 2007. 50 million viewers viewed it in its first 3 weeks here. It's a 2-hour documentary film. We're only concerned with the first part of the film that talks about Jesus. The other parts talk about other things there. It's what we call a conspiracy theory film. It offers there's some sort of conspiracy out there. And one of its messages is that Jesus Christ never existed. He's just a Jewish version of this ancient pagan religious mystery based basically on sun worship. You can actually go and see the film. You can stop this video right now and see it. Anybody can get it online. Go to YouTube and put in Zeitgeist movie. I would suggest skipping the first 12 and a half minutes because that's a lot of junk, that stuff that goes on there. Watch the next 10 minutes of though, and you'll see this idea being promoted, this pagan copycat theory. Now, how does this theory work? Well, it works on the basis of something called parallelism, okay? Those who hold this view usually list a number of characteristics of these deities, of these pagan myths, that are supposed to be parallels to the story of Jesus. They then claim that the gospel writers borrowed these elements from these pagan mystery religions, compiled them into a myth about Jesus. Some of the things they say, well, these mystery religions, the figures in these religions, they were also born of a virgin with a divine father. They were also born on December 25th, hailed as a savior by their followers, given royal and divine titles. They had 12 disciples as well. They were baptized. They performed miracles. They were crucified. They were resurrected. And their death and resurrection is often celebrated in a ritual meal. And they'll point out these similarities and these parallels in these other religious ideas and say, see, this is where the ideas for these came from for the Christian myth here, okay? One scholar actually refers to this as parallelomania, that tactic which first overstates a supposed similarity in passages and then proceeds to describe source and derivation as if implying a connection from one to the other with no real evidence or support for said connection. Most of these parallels are trivial, superfluous, and many of them are in fact complete fabrications. Okay? But they'll use these parallels as an example here. What are some of the religious figures that are picked here? Well, Apollonius of Tyana, a Greek god. Osiris and Horus of Egypt, for example, are often used. Dionysius of Greek Roman mythology. Attis, the Phrygian god. Mithra, Zoroaster. Krishna of Hinduism. All of these are often used as figures that have similarities to Jesus and therefore parallels between them. And that's where the Jesus story came from. We just simply took these and made them into the story. Okay? Now, I want to make 4 general comments about this, and then I want to look at some specific fallacies that I think this idea, this parallelism falls into. this parallelomania. First comment I want to make is this is an old idea. It's not new. Even though sometimes it's presented as this is new stuff we've discovered, it's been around for a long time. In an earlier talk, you might remember I mentioned the history of religion schools of the late 19th century and early 20th century. They had the same basic idea here as well. And many of the people who support this idea quote from those old 19th century sources. That history of religion schools has been long abandoned by serious scholars simply for having any lack of evidence and any real lack of historical value at all. Second thing I want to mention is that there's going to obviously be some similarities between Christianity and other religions. I mean, all religions basically have some things in common. They all believe in usually some sort of divine, godlike figure. They all have rites and ceremonies that express that belief. They all talk about the universal human condition, our desire for meaning, our desire for dealing with evil and sin in the world. All religions have those. However, similarities doesn't imply dependence. And there simply is no evidence of any strong dependence of Christianity or Christian beliefs on pagan religions in the first century. Okay? There's a number of reasons for that. First of all, there was no evidence of any pagan mystery religions in Palestine during the first century when Christianity was developing here. And while mystery religions are highly syncretic in the sense that they absorb each other, Christianity is highly exclusivistic. It doesn't absorb any other religions. It argues against other religions here. Okay? And so therefore, there really doesn't exist of any evidence of that in first century. Now, it would be wrong for me to tell you that Christianity didn't maybe borrow some things from mystery religions. In the 4th and 5th century, for example, there's an argument that basically says that our celebration of the birth of Jesus, the 25th of December, may have come from some of these mystery religions. That's possible, but we're talking 4th and 5th century there. We're talking 500 years after the development of Christianity, not the 1st century, which is when Christianity really came about, okay? A third general comment I want to say is that this whole theory is based on a fallacy we call the fallacy of the false cause, or the post hoc fallacy. Now, what's that fallacy? Well, that fallacy basically says that if event A occurs before event B, then therefore A must have caused B. You probably heard somebody say something like this: I knew it would rain, I just washed my car. As if washing your car actually causes precipitation. Well, of course, that's silly. Nobody really thinks that. We realize even when we say that, we're kind of saying it humorously in that sense. But in fact, that's what's happening in this theory here. The fact that a previous religion may have had a similar belief to that of Christianity does not in itself prove that the previous religion was the cause of the belief in Christianity. You need to argue for a causal chain, and not just simply assert a parallel, and therefore there must be a cause. Not necessarily at all, okay? And I'm going to show you that, in fact, many of the parallels are fabrications anyway. They couldn't have caused anything. The fourth general comment that I want to make about this theory is that the whole theory rests on the premise that Jesus did not exist at all. Or if he did exist, he was a very, very minor character in Palestine who didn't do any of the things the Gospels say, didn't have any of the followers, didn't say any things the Gospels claim that he said, very minor character. But most of them will tell you he never existed at all. And that's a problem, for if the events of the Gospels occurred in history, then of course this whole theory evaporates. According to the copycat theory, every major aspect in the life of Jesus, his birth, his teachings, his baptism, followers, his miracles, crucifixion and resurrection, are not based on historical events. They're based on previous pagan religious myths that were around a long time before the time of Jesus. However, the vast majority of critical scholars across all theological spectrums acknowledge the existence of the historical Jesus and most of the major aspects of his life in some form. Even people that you and I would not necessarily agree with will probably tell you, yes, there was a person by the name of Jesus, and some things about him, some of the things he taught, or some things he did. John Dominic Crossan, who we mentioned in an earlier lecture here, who certainly does not hold a strong evangelical view of Christianity, will tell you that the single most valid or important fact that we know of ancient history is that Jesus Christ was crucified on the cross. But the pagan copycat myth has to argue that none of this occurred at all. Well, what are some of the fallacies of this? Well, I can only mention a few. We can't get into this in any real detail. So I'll mention just a couple of the common fallacies you run into when you read through or see this occur here. And again, go back and watch that Zeitgeist movie and you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see some of these fallacies occurring. The first is what I call the terminological fallacy. Events in the lives of these mythical gods are expressed using Christian terminology in order subtly to manipulate viewers into accepting the same events in the life of Jesus also happening in the lives of other mythical gods. For example, they'll talk about how these gods had virginal births. Is that really what happened here? Well, let's mention just a couple of these, okay? Horus. It's often claimed that Horus was born of a virgin. Not really true at all, okay? Horus was born of the story of Horus's birth is really interesting here. His father Osiris was died, and he was cut up into 13 pieces, and Iris, the wife of Osiris, went around collecting all the 13 pieces together and putting them all together. She then hovered above Horus, okay, and all of a sudden became pregnant with Jesus, okay? But the fact that she was already his wife would argue she probably wasn't a virgin, okay? Attis, okay, how did Attis come about? We're told he was born of a virgin. Not true at all. Zeus, the god Zeus, spills his seed onto a mountain, a pomegranate tree develops, and out of the seed of the pomegranate tree, we have Attis, okay? Krishna, well, Krishna's wife, Devaki, had 7 children before Krishna, so it's hard to really argue that Krishna was born of a virgin. And yet it's simply claimed that this is true of these people. Or sometimes it's claimed that they were crucified, okay? Really? Crucified? Krishna was shot in the heel with an arrow. Not crucified at all. Attis castrated himself and fled into the woods and died. Horus never died at all, or he was stung by a scorpion, or his death is conflated with the death of Orius, depending upon which version of the Horus story you agree with, okay? Resurrection? Nah, that's not there either. Those terms are not simply in those religions. Horus became the lord of the underworld. He was never resurrected back to this life. Attis was eventually turned into a pine tree. Hardly a resurrection. Krishna, earliest tradition says he returned to the spirit world. So even though these Christian terms are used of these divine characters, in fact, if you go back to the original sources, they never use the word crucified or resurrection or virgin birth concerning these people at all. They use Christian terminology to subtly manipulate you into thinking it's the same thing is true of these mythical gods that were true of Jesus. A second fallacy I'll mention is what we call the biblical fallacy. In the biblical fallacy, copycat theorists often will make claims about the life of Jesus that are actually not found in the gospel accounts at all. They originate from other sources. For example, many copycat theorists are quick to point out how all these other gods, Attis and Phrygia and Horus, they were all born on December 25th. But in fact, there's nothing in the Gospels about what date Jesus was born at all. December 25th, we don't know what day he was really born. We're not told that at all in the Gospels. Or the idea of the 3 kings. You'll see in the Zeitgeist movie, if you watch that, they'll point out that the 3 kings idea, that myth in the Gospels came from the stars in the sky that form the Orion's belt, which from ancient history have been called the 3 kings. But in fact, when you look at the gospel account, they're never called kings. We're never told how many that there are at all in any way whatsoever. Okay, this is a Christian tradition that was made popular by a song more than anything else, not in ancient Christian religion, not in the biblical religion of Christianity at all. That's the biblical fallacy. Another fallacy is what we call the chronological fallacy. In order for the copycat charge to succeed, one must provide evidence that the parallel chronology preceded the writing of the Gospels and the New Testament epistles, which were all written in the 1st century. But in fact, we just don't have that. There's no evidence of pagan mystery religions' influence in the 1st century Palestine. The mystery religions, in fact, evolved and changed over the time. And as they did, their beliefs and practices and narratives changed. As a matter of fact, that's one of the hard things with the mystery religions. We're not exactly sure what they believed in 1st century. For example, the myth of Horus is based on a 3,000-year-old Egyptian myth that evolved and changed several times. And as it changed, the story changed. We're not sure which story of Horus we should actually go along with. And oftentimes, copycat theorists will take the story of Horus and they'll conflate different ideas of it to make it look like Jesus, when in fact that's not what's happening there. Okay? Most of the evidence we have of the mystery religions comes from their peak, which was the 3rd and 2nd century, not the 1st century. We have very little information about what their beliefs were in the 1st century. Yet we would have to have that in order to say that Christianity really borrowed from that. Another problem is what I call the source fallacy. Supporters often use secondary sources and do not quote from primary sources when they do this. Most of these second sources have long been discarded and abandoned long ago by critical scholars. These secondary sources often make undocumented assertions, they speculate on causal relationships, and they often select interpretations of text without telling you that there's a lot of interpretation going on in the interpretations of the text that they're giving you there. Of course, one of the reasons why we have so much secondary sources being used here is because the primary sources are often very hard to find. There is no single authoritative primary source for many of these mystery religions that are out there. So here's what the copycat theorists do. They play a game of connect the dots. They set the dots up of these mystery religions in such a way that they'll look like Jesus. Then they connect the dots and they go, wow, that looks just like Jesus. Well, of course it does. That's how they set the evidence up. So it would already come out that particular way here. But in fact, if you look at the primary sources alone, without thinking of Jesus at all, You don't see any Jesus in those sources whatsoever, or any relationship to Christianity whatsoever in those sources. Another fallacy, the final fallacy that I want to mention, is what I call the difference fallacy. Copycat theorists often overemphasize supposed similarities and ignore enormous substantive and relative differences between the mystery religions and what Christianity teaches. The purpose and nature of the pagan mystery religions is completely different than the purpose and nature of Christianity. Mystery religions, for example, are cyclical. They think of death, rebirth, birth, death, and rebirth. Christianity, though, is linear in the way it thinks of time. Okay? Mystery religions involve secrecy. Christianity is not secret at all. It's completely open. In mystery religions, doctrines and beliefs are basically unimportant. What's important is just the worship practices they do. But in Christianity, the doctrines and beliefs are the heart of that religion. Mystery religions are void of any ethical element at all. They don't teach anything about how you should live morally. Christianity very much has a moral aspect to its religious teaching. Mystery religions, importantly, are non-historical. Even those who believed in the mystery religions at the time believed that these were myths. They didn't really happen. Christianity has always taught that Jesus Christ was a real historical person who walked on this earth, did the miracles it's claimed that he did, and those kinds of things there. But most importantly, the meaning and the purpose of the death of Jesus is completely different than the death of the mystery religions' gods. Jesus died for the sins of mankind. None of the mystery religions' gods died for someone else. They always died from some sort of tragic event that occurred to them. Pagan gods died under compulsion. Jesus died willingly. Jesus died and was raised once. The pagans' gods, they died through this vegetative agricultural cycle that goes on year after year. Jesus' death was not a tragic or a defeat. It was considered a victory over death. But the pagans, they mourn and lament the death of their gods. Some concluding comments about this. First of all, many of the claims about ancient religions themselves are very dubious. Second, the vast majority of the claimed parallels simply are not there once one examines the original sources. They're often forced to fit, to look like Christianity. Third, just because there may be some parallels is no evidence itself of strong dependence. Fourth, mystery religions do not claim historicity. Christianity does. Fifth, there is no strong evidence of a strong dependency of the Christian narrative or doctrines on other religions. There simply is no evidence. You can point to parallels, but parallels are not evidence at all. And finally, the non-syncretic nature of Judaism and Christianity is strong evidence against the borrowing from Christian religions. Christianity was strongly monotheistic, believed that you should avoid pagan religions, as Paul told us, for example, in 1 Corinthians, that you shouldn't have anything to do with them. Why would they then go on and borrow their basic beliefs from that? This idea, which again is not very popular in the sense that it's not adopted by many scholars, is still very trumpeted by a few in a very loud voice, and we have to go and answer that particular point here. There's no evidence of Christianity being based on pagan mystery religions at all. We'll move on now and talk about the biggest evidence concerning Jesus Christ.